Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Milliard. I'm editor of Healthcare IT News. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Securing IoT, Essential Steps in Ensuring Patient Safety, sponsored by CI Security. IoT has transformed healthcare in a significant way and is a game changer for providers who embrace next-generation technology. The variety and novelty of these IoT devices introduces a range of cybersecurity concerns related to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad that underpins HIPAA compliance, patient data protection, and overall information security. So today you'll learn how to detect intruders and expel them quickly so you can maintain your security posture and the quality of patient care. Our speakers today are Fred Langston, Executive Vice President of Healthcare Professional Services at CI Security, and Mike Hamilton, Founder and Chief Information Security Officer at CI Security. So with that, I'll hand it over to Fred to begin the presentation.
Welcome, everyone. Just quick background, I've got about 25 plus years in information security, starting back in the mid-90s when I was at IBM and on a working group that put some of the language together that went into the proposed HIPAA security rule. And since that time, been working deeply with healthcare at Guardant, at Symantec, at VeriSign, and leading healthcare organizations to become more compliant and more secure. Mike Hamilton.
So we can blame you then for that HIPAA security rule. That's good to know. So I'm Mike Hamilton. I have about 30 years experience as well in information security, long before the word cyber meant anything. My background is for about the last 10 years in government. I served as a policy advisor to Washington State through the Office of the CIO. I was the vice chair of a Homeland Security Government Coordinating Council for state, local, tribal, and territorial. I was the Chief of Information Security for the City of Seattle for about 8 years, and prior to that, I was the Managing Consultant for VeriSign's Global Security Consulting. So a lot of context I bring to the discussion from the public and private sector. Fred, back to you.
So what we want to talk about today is a somewhat new problem, and that is that absolutely everything at this point is a computer. I don't think much in our day-to-day lives is not contains a computer or processor, and certainly in the healthcare world, it's become basically, I think, the underpinnings of healthcare. For an example of that, in 2017, $41 billion were projected at the IoT healthcare market. By 2022, that number is going to be up to almost $160 billion. So we're looking at 30% growth. That is millions of new devices being deployed into our healthcare environments. So this particular slide here, I always like to point out that you see a bunch of things that maybe you're familiar with, that you're working with every day: patient monitors, MRIs, ultrasounds, robotic surgery systems. Every one of these is a computer. So, you know, we're commonly, in our old world, we've been talking about the EMR and protecting electronic health records. But in the modern world, everything that we're dealing with now has a computer component to it. This is not just in our patient care environments, it's also at home, and things that happen at home can ultimately lead to impacts to our ability to give patient care. So if I can't get to work, I'm going to have a hard time providing patient care. So everything at home now, toys, games, bicycles, TVs. You know, your TV has a microphone so it can actually listen to you now. Your home automation systems that everybody's using. All of these are computers. All of these should be managed just like any other computer. We're talking about in the healthcare world at work. We've got the things that we all are familiar with, the medical devices, you know, things like infusion pumps, patient monitors, any of the imaging devices we're using, like I said, all the way up to robotic surgery systems. But we also have other devices that are IoT devices in a healthcare environment we may not commonly think of as healthcare impacting. Things like the HVAC system, the cooling and ventilation system. If that goes out during a patient procedure, we will probably have to stop giving patient care because an operatory may rise in temperature or get too cold to perform the types of activities we need to perform. Other things like the card keys. So if we're getting in and out of the building and we're using a card or something like that to provide access. We put it up against a reader. That's IoT. That's an operational technology piece that basically is a computer that runs other computers or physical systems. So it's more than just the medical devices. It's all the things that are IoT within a building facility that provides healthcare that can have an impact down the line on patient safety and patient care. And in public, we need to be able to have emergency radio systems so EMTs can get to patients and get them to a care facility in a rapid fashion. So if the radio systems, which are operational technology or a kind of a similar type of industrial IoT, is out, we can't get people even to the facility to get care. The same thing goes for all the other things that are now incorporated in our smart cities world, where along the side of a road, within those vaults and those silver boxes you see by the side of the road, those are all filled with computers. Those are all computers that are running our city and allowing the traffic lights to change and allow people to move, allow water, electricity, sewer to operate. And if these things fail, not only do we take down a city, but we take down the healthcare providers, the hospitals, the emergency services within those environments go down with it, right? So when we're thinking about these things, we can't be so myopic to think, oh, I'm thinking of IoT, I'm concerned with medical devices, medical IoT in my environment, because it's much, much broader than that. So when you're considering the risks associated with this IoT world, it's more than just those devices, right? It's everything in our world now is got an IoT component, and our ability to function, to get from one place to another, to communicate properly, all relies on these IoT devices working correctly. So let's talk a little bit about the medical world. Anything that has a processor, anything that has a network connection, and that network connection can be more than just Ethernet. As we're familiar, it can be radio frequency, right? Medical devices use things like low energy Bluetooth. They use Zigbee radio protocols. They use some proprietary protocols, but ultimately they're all connected. And as you can kind of see on this somewhat blurry diagram here, but this is a really good description of how things tend to flow in a medical environment. We look at the left and we have a patient wearing some kind of personal health monitoring device. Those flow up to some usually aggregation server where all that information starts flowing from a number of patients and it's being acted on in that space. It then moves on up probably to your EMR. And then it very likely continues on out or has a direct connection to a software as a service or something in the cloud. The point here being that if someone can take advantage of any point in this flow, and that may start on a patient monitoring device itself, I have the opportunity to potentially either push bad data or even launch an attack up the stream that can go all the way through our IT systems and even reach all the way up to the cloud. So when we've connected everything together like this, we have now added dozens, hundreds of new points of entry into these networks, dozens of new things to secure, dozens of new sources of EPHI and sensitive information. So you can see by adding this medical IoT overlay onto our computing environments, we're adding whole new layer of areas where vulnerabilities can crop up and avenues for attack. One of the interesting things when we look at, because we monitor at CI Security, we monitor hospitals, medical device networks, things like that. And some of the interesting things that come out of this, when you look at it, 50% of all medical IoT devices happen to be infusion pumps. Yet they are very low in the number of alerts that those systems throw off. And where we see most of the alerts are coming off things like imaging systems. And you have to ask yourself, why would that be? It usually has to do with the fact that imaging systems tend to be very powerful. And they also are a storehouse of multiple patient data rather than a single patient like an infusion pump will provide data for one patient, but an imaging system may contain thousands, tens of thousands of particular pieces of patient data. So it's a high-value target from that perspective. But it's also a high-value target because it's a powerful system. It has a lot of disk space. It's got powerful processors. When I'm looking at an infusion pump, we have something that is as minimally capable as a computing device as possible, because really it's doing some very specific things. It usually is not built with much computing power, so it tends to be, to some degree, a little bit less of a target than the more powerful, more EPHI-rich systems that exist in our environment. Okay,
so
Mike, I'm going to hand this to you and let you take it from here.
So, new problem. I think we all have our own theories as to what blowing up our attack surface is going to result in, but just from a broader perspective, from a 30,000-foot level, the reason all this is a security problem is because policy affects technology by a lot. There's lots of technologies appearing that create efficiencies and can manage energy consumption in buildings and traffic management and ensure that a patient is monitored 24/7, 365 without having to visit, et cetera, et cetera. All that's great stuff. And we want to deploy that stuff. We want to get it working for us. We want to create those efficiencies. But we're not thinking about how the stuff is made and how it will be maintained, and there's no policy around that. Coming from the public sector, Fred talked a little bit about smart cities, and I remember when the debate was going on about automated metering, and sure enough, we found problems in automated meters that had to be fixed before we deployed them. So it's a good thing that a priori we took that on ourselves. The bullet points here, not enough system capabilities. I'll tell you a little story about that. So way back in the day, I actually worked with Fred at VeriSign and Gardent a long time ago. And there was a national grocery store chain that we were hired to penetrate. And they have wireless hand scanners and scales on the deli that did not have sufficient computing power to encrypt wireless connections. They were super dumb. And so they had a wireless network. And so we sat in the parking lot of one of their stores in San Ramon, California, and jumped on the wireless network, walked straight into the pharmacy system, pulled all the records, and started looking for senators' names. That's what happens when there isn't enough system capabilities or computing power to support basic security needs. And now we're back somewhere in that same problem. Installed by varying personnel, integrators range from your own IT staff to Geek Squad to McKesson and everything in between. And the failure to apply oversight there, and again, not having a policy or not having a process by which we change defaults and we ensure that systems are hardened to the extent that we're capable. Largely, that's not happening. We take something out of the box, we throw it out, we call it good. Again, just the application of oversight to ensure that the installation process addresses security is super important. I'd even back up and say that the way the procurement is done is not respecting security. We don't gauge products by their security. We're not to the point yet where security is being used as a market force, but some of the things the federal government are doing are kind of pushing us in that way. So using security as part of your procurement and saying, we'll buy this if you can demonstrate that your product has been through a third-party test against a standard we understand, that's a real good technique too. Now, once it's in there, it may fall completely off the radar and it may be forgotten in terms of the requirement to manage the technology. So again, a process by which we bring in this technology, but we have to have some idea of its entire lifespan, how we are going to handle identification of vulnerabilities, how the manufacturer releases patches, how we get those installed, how we track all of that. Just remember, over the lifetime of the technology, it is going to deteriorate like all technology does. So a priori, prior to bringing this into the environment, having thought through every piece of that lifespan is super important. Also, some interesting research at Vanderbilt. I think this is late last year. You can read the research, but it actually goes into some detail about how there is a number of deaths that can be attributed to the disruption of health sector organizations every year. And I thought, this was maybe a little hyperbolic, but as I read through it, there is good statistical underpinnings here, and it's a peer-reviewed paper. So to the extent that information like this is helpful in your internal communications on how to handle technology, I would recommend that everybody read that. Okay, so we are up to our first poll question here. So does your company, your organization, and my assumption is many of you are health sector, strictly regulate what devices, both corporate and personal, are able to connect to the corporate network? And again, I'm always going to go back to my public sector roots and the fact that there's a big difference between how fast technology advances and how we are able to keep in front of that with policy. And I see that we are coming up, and it looks like 80% or better strictly regulate what devices are able to connect to the corporate network. It'd be interesting to go into some detail around this and see what kind of techniques there are for enforcing the prohibition on unknown technologies. 802.1x is hard to pull off. Give it just a couple more minutes here before we move. Okay, looks like we've stabilized here. We're right at about 80% yes, 13% no, and 8% not sure. That's a pretty interesting result. That's higher than I thought it was going to be for actual management of that. So there's our final results. Looks like 100% of our participants have voted. Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so back to what could possibly go wrong. I don't know if the Mirai botnet is as familiar to everyone else as it is to folks that are in the InfoSec community. A botnet is a network of computers that are under the control of somebody else, and you don't have knowledge of that. So they've been commandeered so that they can be used for a variety of things. And way back in the 20th century, that was your desktop computer. Well, today, it's any one of these computers Fred talked about that you hang on the internet. So this botnet was built last year, and it became famous very quickly for the denial of service attacks that were leveled from cameras and DVRs and things like that were taken over. When your technology, your IoT, is taken over by something like this, and really, if you hang a camera on the internet where it's detectable from the internet and you have not changed the default password, that's going to be somebody else's camera in about 2 minutes, and that is no exaggeration. This new variant targets signage, TVs, presentation systems, and is generally thought to be targeting enterprises more than home IoT. Previously, there was a lot of home IoT involved. In fact, there's a story that I'll tell you that happened about 6 or 8 weeks ago. A very large school district in this region, up in the Seattle area, was hit by what looked like a denial of service attack. But when we peeked under the covers, what we saw was a password guessing attack. And all the password guessing was coming from microtick routers at people's homes in Brazil. So, there was a big sweep, went out over the internet. It identified microtick routers with whatever vulnerability, and that may have been just a default password, took them over and used them as a cannon to fire at this particular school district. This is definitely the primary use of these botnets as they're being created, but it can also be used for entrance into the larger network for the purpose of records exfiltration, surveillance, launching internal attacks. I am always careful to point out that there are 3 things that go wrong unauthorized disclosure of protected records, theft and extortion, and service disruption. And sometimes they travel together. Service disruption can be used to extort you. Those are the outcomes. And then there's a number 4, using your technology to launch as an attack against somebody else. There have been unbelievable amounts of traffic focused through these botnets, and very famous individual, Brian Krebs, who's a security researcher and journalist. Somebody didn't like what he wrote, so they blew him offline. So this Mirai botnet is now coming back, and it's there are a lot of new vulnerabilities that are being tried. There are new products that are in the portfolio. This thing is growing and growing and growing. F5 Networks actually, I think, is the best at tracking how these are growing and what they're being used for. So all of the things that you see on the screen there are all in scope. And again, hanging something to where it is findable on the internet, and there is a system called Shodan that is specifically designed to go find stuff connected to the internet. This botnet is being built as we speak in your pumps and monitors. If they have been deployed insecurely and they are findable, they are going to be pulled into this. And again, this is what happens. You know, for the most part, that botnet is used as a cannon. And it's gotten so big that you know, we're talking about nation states' ability to poke economies. There was actually an economy in Africa where a denial of service event took their internet connection down, and because the collateral damage with all their businesses was in millions and millions and millions of dollars, it became a demonstration of how a nation-state economy can be affected by a commodity botnet. So that's kind of where we have landed. And I'll say notably, this may soon implicate organizations as accomplices. There's some discussion right now about who is at fault if your stuff was deployed insecurely and then weaponized to use to create financial damage to another organization. The Federal Trade Commission and other enforcement organizations may be interested soon. So heads up on that. Fred, you want to talk about WannaCry?
Sure. You know, and one thing I did want to cover too, I think is interesting about any of these, like WannaCry and the Mirai botnet. People say, well, how do you launch an attack like this? Well, most people don't know, but you go on the dark web and you go to a site that essentially looks like Amazon, and you say, I want to spend this much money to have it go on this long, throw this many of your endpoints at it, your botnet endpoints at it, and you basically order something like you'd order on Amazon, and a couple clicks later you're paying in Bitcoin, and these attacks are launched. So you need zero technical skill to launch these. You're just basically renting systems and using an interface like you're buying something off Amazon. WannaCry was particularly interesting and had some direct impacts on healthcare. WannaCry was a ransomware virus that swept through basically across the world. It hit the British National Health Service and was down to pen and paper for over a week. It looks like it cost over £100 million, and 19,000 people lost their appointments. This essentially shut down the British National Health Service for over a week. It affected a number of other major corporations, Merck, Nuance. It was highly disruptive and had a direct impact on healthcare. We talked about how these things impact medicine, but it impacts other things as well. For example, 300 medical devices were pointed out by what we call the Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. Basically an organization that puts out bulletins about vulnerabilities. They found 300 medical devices from 40 different vendors that had the same problem that is behind the Mirai botnet or behind a lot of these other attacks, and that is hard-coded passwords. And you may ask, why would somebody hard-code a password onto these devices? Well, it goes back to what Mike was talking about when he said these are highly underpowered devices. In other words, we're putting the minimum amount of computing power into this because we're really trying to build a healthcare device. So we're not putting the time and effort into the underlying operating system, and they end up with things like hard-coded passwords. So this is obviously, a big problem. It crosses many sectors and is now in the middle of the healthcare space with medical devices. The interesting thing is the government's finally starting to step up. They've issued a new response guidance book. In other words, if you are attacked in your medical devices, as you can see, the FDA's put out a playbook, so how you can respond if you feel your medical devices have been compromised. They've also put out guidance on things that should be recalled because they have particular vulnerabilities that, if taken advantage of, the worst possible scenario, patient harm, is resulting from this. So they're really starting to look at all the security beneath these and providing guidance to the manufacturers as well. So there's guidance that's come out through the HICP program, pointing to how manufacturers should be securing these, as well as how end users. So it's two-part guidance, right, that they put out, how end users should be securing these devices as well. So you can see we see this in all sorts of types of devices. CT scanners with outdated software literally would allow changes to the adjustment of the radiation that would be coming out of these systems and literally could harm a human being or, potentially even kill them in the long run. So what are they after? Everybody kind of like, well, why do they care about these devices? Well, Mike mentioned they're perfect to create a zombie army of bots to be used in either a distributed denial of service attack, where we throw all the computing power across the network at a particular target to take it offline. But they're also looking to do crypto mining. So that is kind of the attack du jour. The DHS said that's the #1 attack to be faced globally this year. And that means that they're going to use that processor. So all they really care about, they don't care about what's on the device. They just want to use that processor so they can mine Bitcoins, right? Sounds pretty straightforward approach. They make money, and you may not even know this is going on because they're just chugging away using your processor. They may also store illicit data, everything from stolen EPHI, but it could be other types of, very harmful types of data, things that we certainly don't want on your networks. They may be distributing malware. They may be also using the phone. So as I mentioned, these things network in a number of ways. They have radios, they have regular network connections, but a lot of them also are using phones, right? So they're going to go in and they're going to use these for phone fraud. So if I have a weakly secured device and I can take it over, I can start using that phone within the device that it communicates everywhere for phone fraud. The types of things we may do, right? So those are the things they're looking for. The things they may do, they may use it for surveillance and eavesdropping. We know that now that TVs even have microphones and speakers built into it. It's essentially an eavesdropping device. You're installing it maybe in the room where people are checking to see the status of a patient in a procedure. I know I check, when my family goes in, we kind of monitor things, and those devices can be used for surveillance and basically turned inside out, if you will, so they're listening rather than speaking to you. Famously, the U.S. government used this type of attack to take over the uranium enrichment facilities when they were trying to create enough fuel to create a bomb, and they took over these industrial systems, operational technology systems, and had them physically run at such a rate as to self-destroy themselves. When we think about a medical device environment, we may be thinking about, as we mentioned, the radiation coming from a imaging device, or even a surgical robot doing something that not only harms the patient, but they're powerful enough to even harm a physician or an physician's assistant performing a procedure. So the realm of possibilities is very broad. Although we haven't seen this happen yet, it's certainly within the realm of possibility. They may be going after EPHI, and they may be going after harmfully reconfiguring these devices. If we have a drug infusion pump, somebody may go in and either cut back or provide way too much of a particular drug to a patient. I'm going to probably hand it back over to Mike, and he can kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that we recommend you can do to start fixing some of these problems.
Yeah, you know, I think the transition to this crypto mining is a very interesting development, and I don't think it's because there's ethics in the criminal community, but I do know that, you know, the application of ransomware as an extortion technique, that is the one specifically in that paper that was done by the Vanderbilt researcher. That's really the disruption that is in scope when they're talking about loss of life due to the disruption of the health sector organizations through this ransomware. And, you know, I don't think that it's, an ethical dilemma for anybody that's actually in crime, especially as Fred points out. It's crime as a service now. You don't need to have any skills. You just buy it on the dark market and wait for the money to show up. But this shift over to, I'm going to use your CPU to mine cryptocurrency rather than I'm going to encrypt your environment to extort you is an interesting development, but I would point out that it's largely tied to the price of cryptocurrency. If cryptocurrency tanks to where all of this mining is not going to pay off, they're going to go back to other criminal activities. And I'll just point that out. Today, crypto mining is something that we're running into all the time. And here's just an example. We found crypto miners running in a customer's VoIP phone systems, not the place you would think of finding compromised computing assets that have been put to work to do a specific task on behalf of a threat actor. But a VoIP phone system is a computing system, and sure enough, you know, here's an example of how this kind of technology gets taken over and people put it to work to make illicit money, and eventually we have to suss that kind of thing out. The only way to see this, right, clearly prevention has failed here, is to be surveilling network communications to make sure that you can identify things that are aberrational. Your phones talking to command and control servers on the internet is aberrational. And so when you see it and you peel back the covers and you investigate that, you find, hey, CPUs are all spiked. It's pretty surprising the first time it happens. So let's talk about how to address the risk here, because there's two terms to risk expression. And one of those is likelihood, one of those is impact. But before you do anything, you have to know what you have. I'll point out that the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was developed by executive order a few years ago, and is an outcome-based framework, right? So it's not prescriptive as to the control that you put in place. It says, here's the outcome, and you achieve that in the way that's right for your business or your organization. It's split up into five focus areas, and the first one of those is identify. And with a good deal of authority, I can tell you that most organizations don't progress very well past that point at all. Most organizations do not know what's on their network, and in some cases under people's desks. I personally found commodity hubs in a dam operation. It's surprising, and yet it's not. So how do we find these things? Especially if they've aggregated over time and there's a lot of things that have been deployed before we have this awareness that this was such an issue. Certainly going back through your paper is a way to go. That's not the best way, but that might be all you have. There's new technology now that's automating the discovery and classification of these devices. And there's a few logos here, and these are companies with whom we partner on a variety of levels. for integrating a capability into our own service, because this identification is supremely important. You cannot secure what you do not know. Knowing what's on your network is, I think, very enlightening for most organizations. It's pumps and monitors, yes, but it's also cameras, it's thermostats. All of these things that are now computers, to Fred's original point, can all introduce risk into a patient care environment. There's a variety of techniques, not all of these companies, and this is not an exhaustive list. There's a variety of techniques that they use to identify these, and some of these must use radio frequencies because not everything's on a wired network. Some of these look at more than just medical technologies. Some are very focused, Order, for example, on medical technologies. But these are very interesting, somewhat nascent companies and technologies. There's also a difference between passive asset discovery, where I'm listening to the network and I have a dictionary of the behavior of every kind of device. And so as I see its traffic pass by my sampling point, I can characterize what it is. That's different than active asset discovery, where I'm going to go hurl packets around. Typically, this is how it's done in an IT environment because you can get away with that. But if you are using an active technique in a medical technology environment, the risk of a bad outcome is quite high. I can give you an example from a friend of mine who is the chief of information security for a large city in the Pacific Northwest, who decided that doing a vulnerability scan of the streets network and the automated traffic system was a good idea. And 21 intersections flashing red later recalibrated that thought. It was not the best idea. So we know that PBXs do not react well. Operational technologies, to the extent that there are operational technologies in the environment, do not behave well. Programmable logic controllers, RTUs, things like that, which are not as in scope for hospitals but do exist. HVAC, for example, is a control system. Active asset discovery is probably not a good choice, so passive asset discovery. Also, what's allowed to talk to what? That's a very interesting question, and it allows you to develop a statistical representation of what's normal. And if you know what's normal, it becomes much easier to identify what is aberrational traffic. For example, there are some devices which need to reach out to the mothership and say, hey, do you have any updates for me? There are many devices that do not, and over time, characterizing which do and which do not becomes just a matter of listening long enough. And then when something does some talking that it's never done before, that should raise an alert. That's the kind of thing that you need to investigate. So this fast investigation and knocking down the little fire before it burns out down the house is extremely important. A couple of slides ago, I said that there are two terms to the risk expression, likelihood and impact. Well, after identifying all of these devices, and by the way, Shodan here is a link that you can use to go find things like home routers with default passwords in Bulgaria. Go ahead, it's kind of fun. You won't get in any trouble. But securing these, let's think about this. So there's preventive controls that you can put in place, and what those will do is lower the likelihood of an outcome. And then there is detection and response. So if we can all unwrap our heads from the fact that we can be so good at security that we can make bad things never happen, because that's never going to be true, and we say these things are going to happen, well, then let's have a response plan and ability to detect these aberrations so that we can get in front of these quickly. There is some good guidance here from the FDA on this. As Fred said, that we're making some progress on coming up with a standard, a security standard, if you will, an underwriter's laboratory's seal of approval so that we know that what we buy has been tested against an acceptable standard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Get rid of what you don't need, and then consider how to handle that risk, my preventive controls versus my detection and response. I want to buy down risk in the likelihood of a bad thing happening, and I also want to buy down risk in the inevitability of that bad thing actually happening. I'm going to try and make it not happen, but when it does, I got to be ready. That's what that risk assessment is about. That's where we determine how much risk there is based on the likelihood of an event and the impact of it happening, and then we can avoid that risk, accept that risk, mitigate that risk through controls, or ensure that, transfer that risk through insurance. We'll dive into the insurance issues sometime later. It's that's a pretty big topic for right now. So again, I'll just double down on this. Visibility is key. Knowing what you have, knowing something about the provenance. Did we buy this 5 years ago before anybody knew that it needed to authenticate its communications? That's probably a good thing to start reviewing. Isolate them on the network by segmentation is really a great thing to do. In fact, that is one of the lowest cost, highest benefit techniques you can use, is to segregate these devices into network enclaves where we don't let other traffic pass. If it needs to reach out to the internet, or if it needs to go to an update server somewhere, and you may run that internally, characterize those communications. But for crying out loud, make sure you're watching the network so that when something starts to talk in a way that is not anticipated, you get in front of that. Unfortunately, a lot of alerts are thrown off technologies when you're watching them like this, and it really does mean that you have to provide somebody somewhere to investigate and run these to ground to determine if they're real or not. 99% of security alerts on a network are not real. So staffing that appropriately and throwing analytics at that to make sure that you can figure out the real from the unreal, it's a good thing to involve yourself in for patient safety. It's even better to outsource. So here's another polling question. So as we've talked about IoT devices and the need to segment the networks they are in and to procure them with security in mind and to monitor them so that we understand when there is abnormal or aberrational traffic and investigate those, do you feel your organization is effectively monitoring these devices that clearly pose a threat? And that is the predictable response that I actually anticipated. So I'm saying the greatest response is no.
Yeah, there's nothing surprising about the results we're kind of seeing here. It aligns with our experience.
Okay, so that's where we are, and again, not a surprise. And again, I will continue to double down on this. Policy lags technology by a lot, and if we could just reverse those things so that anytime we were going to bring technology into an environment, we knew exactly what questions we were going to ask of the vendor. We knew how we were going to do the procurement and how we would score security, that we would cause our vendors to have not only something that was secure out of the box, but a plan going forward to identify vulnerabilities, produce patches, notify customers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've never done that, and so this is where we've landed. Fred, you want to talk about this a little bit?
Sure. We did throw some resources. We know people probably are looking for some ways to do a quick assessment. You can saunter over to our website, and we have a quiz that can give you a real high-level understanding of where you're at in terms of your risk. It's something you can actually kind of start the conversation with the executives or whoever management is to start including these whole set of devices that we don't normally think of. We also have...
I think this is actually one of the quiz questions, isn't it?
Yes,
yeah,
it is. So Right. So this is an example of the kind of thing you would be seeing in that quiz materials. The last thing we want to talk about, and Mike has hit on the risk equation and how the preventative controls, as strong as they are, they fail. We know that. And people have, for so often, left in the impact part of the risk equation alone. And it's the part that we really need to start addressing, and that is by minimizing the dwell time for these attackers. We know they're going to get in. We need to minimize the time that they're in there to do damage. So we highly recommend that you focus a lot on the other side, the impact side, which means monitoring, which means you're watching the traffic, you're watching these technologies, you're watching what they're doing and who they're communicating with on a regular basis. And you need to do this on a 24/7, 365 basis. One of the reasons we commonly talk about outsourcing this component is most people don't want to go and try to hire a bunch of security unicorns, which are more in demand than any job I think on the entire planet right now. They're the hardest to keep. They change jobs all the time. So unless you can really build a robust monitoring program 24/7 with people that do nothing but that, we tell people it's really important to think about outsourcing that component, but you absolutely have to have monitoring in place. And IoT monitoring and Med-IoT monitoring is somewhat different than what you would expect for regular systems. For example, medical devices don't take agents, right? We can't install an agent on a medical device. So you have to use some form of pure network monitoring, either passive or active, but it's got to be something on the network, and it can't, because we can't install things on those devices. And we have to understand what kind of communications these devices make. If we haven't been monitoring them before, we don't know what normal equals for a medical IoT device. So you need expertise there, and then you need the ability to get in there and investigate things quickly and have the data you need to go in and say, yeah, it looks like this device is actually compromised. The processor is pegged at 100%. Looks like a crypto miner, and then we go back to that playbook that we saw the FDA put back as like 10, 15 slides back, and we execute on that based on what's in the playbook. And our whole push here is to reduce the dwell time down to minutes, because right now I can't remember, but it's well into the mega number of months that people have problems. So we want to wrap up there. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, let me just add. This is fundamentally a people problem. There are technologies emerging that will guarantee that they will automate the process of detection and then taking an action. They're not yet there yet, and this really is a people problem. Needing people to investigate, confirm, and take action is still where we are today. And I'll just give you a little piece of anecdotal evidence that I've found from talking to a number of my peers. So the SOAR and the automation technologies, orchestration, automation, et cetera, artificial intelligence, the reason those technologies are procured specifically is to be able to detect anomalies and take actions. And to a person, what I've been told is they've got to throw so many people at these technologies to get them to work that if the original intent was to control employee resources, they have achieved an outcome that is exactly the opposite of the one they intended. So people problem, figuring out how to get people staffed here, whether you do it internally, hire a service, whatever you do. I wouldn't hang my hat on any of the technologies just yet. And with that, I think it's a good break point to ask if there are any questions.
All right. Thanks to you both, Fred and Mike, for a really terrific presentation. We've already got some questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. You can please feel free to submit some of your own just by clicking the Ask a Question panel on your screen. And there are also some links in the handout section there for you to check out. So for our first question, and I'll toss this out to either or both of you, someone's asking, how does one deal with vendors refusing to allow deployment of foundational security controls, such as antivirus, by referencing FDA warranty and the possibility that any changes to the medical device will void the FDA warranty?
Sure. I'll
Wow,
just
that is
thread
a
on.
really great question. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Fred.
that's a good one. So this is an interesting state of affairs because by 2000, about 2012 or so, the medical device manufacturers flat out said, if you touch our devices, you void the warranty, all bets are off. And then the FDA said, you know what, we're going to stand on your neck because that is not an acceptable approach. You can't put out utterly insecure devices. You can't have things that we can't secure. So the things to do, one is try to develop a patch management system with, probably in conjunction with the medical device manufacturer, but do your testing on a test network with test devices. Pick a standard configuration that goes pushed out to all those devices, test with that configuration, and then work with your medical device vendor to say, we believe that we have validated that this security patch is not going to impact the functionality of this. We want you to recertify this device with the patches on it so we can go out and secure our devices. But in the absence of that, this is why the monitoring component becomes so critical, because we only have so much leverage, contractual leverage with our medical device manufacturers, and when they won't or don't have the resources or the time or are working on it and haven't gotten there to secure these devices, we need other ways to do it, and that is through heavy monitoring and making sure that we can respond as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I'd give a corollary to that too. There are devices that, in fact, there was one in the news recently. I believe it's an MRI. It's an imaging system where the control system that operates it has to be a Windows 2000 system, and so, which is ancient technology, which cannot be updated anymore if the manufacturer has not certified another operating system for use, and so it has to exist. So that really is the answer. You have to accept that risk on the face of it, but then you can mitigate it through good monitoring and making sure that any unexpected traffic is investigated. That was a great question.
Excellent. Here's another question. Someone in the audience is wondering, why can't you install agents on devices?
So,
most of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say it kind of goes back to what we just said. One is medical device manufacturers aren't going to let you install an agent on their device because it's certainly not certified to operate on it. And not to mention, most of these devices are running on, as Mike said, old operating systems, old embedded operating systems, some very small footprint operating systems. So most companies don't make an agent for Windows 2000 or XP embedded, right? If you're running on a QNX, if you know embedded systems, that's an embedded systems manufacturer. Nobody makes an agent for a QNX embedded system. So rarely are you going to come across these devices that either have the power, have an operating system that an agent is built for, right? And even when agents can be installed, they may not be built to understand anomalous activity because it's used to a user on a laptop doing certain things, and it sees things that user does and says that's bad, but it doesn't know what's good or bad when a medical device is communicating out to the internet or to some other system. So that tends to be the real hurdle around agents on medical devices.
Yeah, putting McAfee on your pacemakers is not going to work.
Yeah.
Another question here, kind of about staffing. In trends you guys see within healthcare organizations, do you tend to see or do you foresee, all this additional monitoring and responsibility being absorbed by existing IT staff, or are, these organizations, tending to stand up new groups to take on medical devices, IoT, and other non-traditional, computing devices?
Yeah, what I have seen is it becomes IT's job. And largely because security practitioners are in extremely short supply, they are extremely expensive, and I can tell you with a good deal of authority, they're pretty flaky. They will change jobs every 6 months because they know they can double their salary. So given that, it is largely falling to the IT group to handle follow-up investigation of events that may have security implication in an environment. That said, there are a number of dangers to doing it that way, not the least of which is you're going to get these folks some training, and they're going to figure out they can make a bunch more money going into security, and they may leave to do that. That's an excellent threat that's never going to go away. I think, universally applicable is the fact that when IT folks are chasing security issues, neither IT nor security is being done well. And so all of the digital transformation projects that are underway, not only in the health sector, but also, with smart cities and industrial manufacturing, all of these areas, they need to be watched. There aren't enough people, and we have to find efficiencies and ways to centralize those folks and make them available. And so managed detection and response is one way to do that.
All right. Someone else is wondering which software you might recommend to monitor network or devices.
So you want me to jump in on that?
Okay, and then I want to go too. Go.
You got it. So I think the thing that we look at when we think about that, we think about it's what are you monitoring as opposed to the technology brand or vendor that you're buying or something like that. Because at any one time, in all honesty, there's about 5% difference between capabilities in differing software packages and monitoring packages. And the key is, are they monitoring the right thing? So we believe that you, have to have something that is actually monitoring the network at the level of capturing the packet, going by and being able to replay everything that happened over a specific period of time. Because the only way you can get actual validation from all the data that you should be collecting is by actually looking at what exactly happened. The normal way people will do it is collect logs from the systems and do log analysis. We absolutely think that that's a key part of it, but it's not going to give you everything you need to eliminate all the false positives. And if you've ever been involved in a monitoring program, literally you can get hundreds of thousands of alerts a day from an environment. Mm-hmm. And most of those are going to be, 99% will be false positives. So you need a very powerful system that can help you reduce all those and easily eliminate most false positives. And like I said, you need the ability to dig even deeper by looking at the actual, just like a network flight recorder, if you will, exactly mm-hmm. what happened, packet by packet, click by click. Mike?
Yeah. There is no substitute for a packet capture to answer the question, what happened here? I will point out, so using an unstructured database to use for aggregating information and applying some analytics, Elastic is a great company. If you wanted to handle this yourself, it becomes difficult to do if you want to supply 24/7, 365 operation, because then you're going to need, a dozen analysts. And again, they're really hard to come by. But you can put something together yourself using something like Elastic. There's also an open source SIM. OSIM is the open source variant of Alien Vault, and it kind of works. So if you wanted to hand roll it, there are ways to do that. You can also buy expensive solutions. I'm not going to go down the litany of SIM systems, but way back in the 20th century, there was these correlation engines. Today, one good recommendation I would give you is developed by the NSA, and it does passive monitoring of operational technologies. You might want to take a look at that.
And I think that you cut out there, Mike, he was speaking of Grass Marlin. I don't know if that came through.
Yeah, Grass Marlin, developed by the NSA, passive monitoring, usually for use in operational technology environments where there are programmable logic controllers, things like that. But it's got a real flexible dictionary so that you can describe your own devices and it will start to identify them for you.
Excellent. We're just about at the top of the hour, but let's squeeze in one more before we wrap up. And I think you guys could probably answer whatever ones we don't get to offline after the event. But someone here is wondering about the phone systems being taken over by a bot attack that you'd mentioned earlier. do the bad guys generally look for more powerful systems in a bot attack like that, or do they take anything that they can get?
That's completely opportunistic. You know, I mean, remember, there are sweeps constantly going over the internet looking for targets. And as soon as they find a target, it's a target. And it's a question of volume. If they're going to do this crypto mining becomes really expensive to do if you're paying for your own power. But if I'm using an army of 10,000 or 100,000 devices spread out over the world and a little bit of computing power on every one, that adds up very quickly to enough computing power for me to mine cryptocurrency and actually get paid doing it. So it's completely opportunistic.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both once again for a terrific presentation, and thanks, of course, to the audience for joining us today. At this time, we do have to wrap up. But I would like to invite the audience to please complete the evaluation at the conclusion of the event and share your thoughts with us. And just a reminder that today's session will be available on demand for 1 year through the HIMSS Learning Center. Thanks again to everyone, and have a great day.